Hi, my name is Leandro Facchinetti, and in this video I'm going to show you how to deploy an application that I created called Kill the Newsletter. And some of what we are going to talk about in this video is specific to how Kill the Newsletter works, but most of it applies to any kind of web application that you would like to deploy. In fact, I think that deploying Kill the Newsletter is a great system administration exercise because at the same time it is somewhat simple to deploy, as we are going to see, but it's not a trivial application. It is a web application that also has to receive emails, so it is also an email server, and it has to work with HTTPS, all those sorts of things that are interesting from a system administration perspective. So let's jump right in. I'm going to first show what Kill the Newsletter does and how it works. It's a very simple application. As it's written right here, it converts emails, newsletters into Atom feeds. So that's if you are the sort of person who likes to read newsletters because you like their content, but you don't like to read in the format of emails, newsletters, so you don't like to receive emails with your news. You prefer to use an RSS reader or Atom reader, things like Feedly, for instance. So what this is going to do is you say that, let's say that you want to sign up for a newsletter about, I don't know, deploying Node.js applications. Right? Suppose that there is a newsletter about this and you want to sign up for it. So you create a new inbox, and now this is going to give you two addresses, an email address and the address for an Atom feed. The email address you use to sign up for the newsletter. So now we can click here on copy and we go to the provider of this newsletter. We go to the deploying Node.js applications.org or something, and we sign up with this email. And then we go to our news reader, something like Feedly. I think that's the most popular one. It's the one that comes to mind. So you go there and you sign up for the newsletter using this address. Now, anytime that the publisher of the newsletter sends a new email to this address, Kill the Newsletter is going to receive that email, convert it into an Atom feed entry, and put it here. So your news reader, for instance, Feedly, will have that email as a new entry on the feed. That's almost entirely the scope of the application. There is also one extra thing, and that is sometimes the feed readers link to an alternate version of the content, which is just plain HTML containing the body of the Atom feed entry. And Kill the Newsletter is also capable of serving that. So let's take a look at this Atom feed. When you have just created a new Atom feed and in Kill the Newsletter, it puts an entry there with this same material, this same content here. It's just for the benefit of what happens if you have signed up for the Atom feed but you forgot the email address. Then there is that entry there, which means that we can go to the command line. I'm not going to use Feedly for this demonstration, but you can just query the Atom feed, and here is the content of the Atom feed, and here is the HTML for that part that we were looking at that says sign up for the newsletter, blah, blah, blah. And what's interesting here is this alternate link. As I said, it's a link for an HTML version hosted at Kill the Newsletter of the same material that we were looking at before. So this is the material of the entry in the feed. Anytime we receive an email in Kill the Newsletter, we will have one of these alternates as well. These HTML pages will be served as well. And that is the entirety of the scope of this application. It is a web application. It is also an email server, and it has to run in HTTPS. So what we are going to do now is deploy our own version of this. We can go to the repository with the code for Kill the Newsletter. It's a Node.js application written mostly in TypeScript. And you can just download and run on your machine. And for the most part, you don't even have to worry about the fact that it's written in Node.js, because I'm also sharing the application. Yes, you can download the source code and run with Node.js if that's what you want. But if you just want to get started and see how the application works, you can also use the compiled versions, the binaries, and you can just run the binaries. And that's what we're going to do in this exercise. And we are going to go with first, we are going to run on our local machine just to see that everything is working like it should, and we can give it a try. It will be our first time running the application on our machine. Then I will go over the DNS configuration that you have to do to set up everything. I will not show you how to buy a domain. That's something that is relatively straightforward. You can just go to a registrar website and choose a domain and buy it. But I'm going to show you how to set up the DNS for the web application and for the email server. And I will also briefly cover what a DNS server even is, what it means to configure DNS, in case that's your first time doing this sort of thing. And then I will go to DigitalOcean and actually buy a server, and then configure the server, deploy Kill the Newsletter to the server, and see it live running in the browser like so. So that's going to be our journey in this video. Let's start, as I said, with the simple exercise of grabbing the binary, the executable for Kill the Newsletter, and running it on our machine. We should be able to see something that looks like this, except that it will not be in killthenewsletter.com. It will be on localhost on our machine. And there is documentation about how to do this here in the README. What we are going to do in the video is more or less a walkthrough of the README. Anyway, so let's start with downloading and running Kill the Newsletter on our machine. There are different binaries, executables for different operating systems. As you can probably tell, I am on Mac OS. So I'm going to grab this version. I'm copying the link, and just for good measure, because we are doing all this system administration stuff, I'm going to download this on the command line. It's not really relevant. You could just click here and download using the browser. Anyway, let's do it from the command line. I'll go to downloads, and I want to make a folder for this to keep things organized. So I'll go into that folder and download this file. That was fast. I wonder if that worked. I don't think it did. That should have redirected, and I missed the L flag. Now it's going to take a while to download the application because it is somewhat big. And just as a curiosity, this has been packaged with a tool that I created called Cache. You can watch another video in this channel about Cache if you are developing Node.js applications and you want to package them for people to be able to install as easily as we are going to do in this video. Anyway, okay, so now we have a file that is the right size. And we can extract this with tar, extract zip file, this name. And then we have the Kill the Newsletter executable. We can check that it is an executable. It has the executable flag, so we can just literally run Kill the Newsletter, the executable. And it's going to take a while to start the first time, but then it's going to be fast. And it's already started, so we are running Kill the Newsletter 1.1, and we started both the web server as well as the email server. So let's go to this URL and check this out. And there you go. We are running locally the thing that is running live. So now we can create a newsletter like deploying Node.js applications locally. Well, to deploy locally doesn't really make sense. Anyway, creating an inbox. And now we have the email address and the Atom feed, but this time it is for localhost. And to test emails in a local machine, you cannot just go to your mail app and try to send an email to localhost. That will not go through, I don't think. Depending on your email client, it may work, but in most cases it won't. So there is a workaround for you to test locally. And yes, there are automated tests in the code base, but I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about manual tests here. The way to do this is to create a file that looks like this. So that's what I'm gonna do. Open a new tab here and cat into email text, and I will paste this. So now that was a convoluted way of creating a file that has this material. Now we can use curl to send emails. Oh, but we need to change this address, right? Because we have a different identifier here. So I'll just go ahead and grab this and change the material in email text, change the rest of this line so that it reads R55, that's correct. So I can save and quit. And I also need to change the curl command that you can find here on the README. I need to change the destination here as well. So I'm going to delete these and copy that again. And so I sent an email using curl. So curl is usually used to make HTTP requests from the command line, but you can also speak other protocols, including SMTP, which is the protocol for sending emails. So you can send emails using curl. Isn't that fun? Now we are going to use curl again to check the material in the newsletter over here. And it does have that initial entry, but it also has the material from our test email as a new entry in the feed. And if we were to sign up with a feed reader, it would have to be a local feed reader on my machine. It could not be something like Feedly because it needs to access localhost. But we could sign up for this newsletter and we would see the new entry. That's pretty much all there is to the application. I guess we can also go to the alternate to see that it's there. So now the alternate here on localhost, and it has some HTML. Good. Now that we did this, we are ready to deploy to a real server this time. So we will be doing pretty much the same steps we did on our local machine, but we have to do some extra preparation work before we even get to that. We need to rent a new machine. We need to set up DNS, because when we run in production, we are accessible to the whole world. Okay, so let's start with the server that we are going to rent. So here I am in DigitalOcean. That is one provider of servers that you can rent. Really, you can rent servers from DigitalOcean or from Linode or from AWS or from a Raspberry Pi you have in your closet. It doesn't really matter, as long as it's a machine that is accessible from the internet, specifically one that is capable of receiving email. That's all you need, really. And keep in mind that most machines that you would have on your under your desk, like a Raspberry Pi or something, those would not be able to receive email because most internet service providers block that kind of traffic to prevent spam. So if you have like a home connection, you are not able to receive email on port 25 using that internet cable. So you have to go to something like DigitalOcean. And that's what I am using to run Kill the Newsletter proper. If you go to killthenewsletter.com, you are going to a DigitalOcean machine. It's the cheapest machine available on DigitalOcean, and it has been able to handle a good amount of traffic. It's not like this is Google, but it's a somewhat popular service used by around, I guess, 60,000 feeds. And the traffic sometimes gets a huge spike when, for some reason, it goes to the front page of Hacker News. Doesn't matter. Even in those cases, a simple $5 per month machine using DigitalOcean was capable of handling that kind of traffic. So let's create a new machine. I'm not touching the existing one that's running on production. We are creating a new one from scratch for this exercise. And now let's go through the options that we have here. So we are going to run on one of these operating systems. I'm just going to keep this as the default. It doesn't really matter all that much. We just need an operating system capable of running one executable. and that's good enough. Ubuntu 20.04 is good enough. So for the kind of machine, there are all these dedicated, specialized machines, but really a basic machine is good enough for us, and a basic SSD is also good enough. And as I said, $5 per month is the one that is running killthenewsletter.com. I'm sure that your deployment will, this machine will handle your deployment just fine. So moving on, you can choose whatever server location you want here. If you are in one of these locations, like you are in Germany, you should probably pick the one that is closest to you. killthenewsletter.com is running in New York, and it is the closest to most Kill the Newsletter users, I suppose. I don't track the users, so I don't know. But here where I am in Portugal, so I think that the closest one may be London or Frankfurt. So I'm going to create one in Frankfurt. Why not? Now, in terms of additional options, I always enable IPv6 because it doesn't cost anything, but I never even set up the DNS for that. And I don't need that. That would be to set up the machine automatically when the machine is created. It sets everything that you need up, but we are not going to do that. We are going to do it on the command line manually. And then as for monitoring, it's kind of nice to have some graphs. I don't usually look at them, but again, it's free. It's kind of nice to have these additional metrics. Now, how are we going to connect to the machine once we have created it? Well, that's what this is for. You can use a password, but I don't advise you to do that. It's better to do SSH. So you probably already have SSH keys to work with Git, and more specifically, probably to work with GitHub. If you don't have SSH keys, just follow the GitHub tutorials on how to create SSH keys. Then go to your DigitalOcean settings, probably under account here, and add your SSH key, and it will be available here, and that's my SSH key. Then by selecting this, I will be able to connect to the machine. You can see that there is also another SSH key, and that's for deploying Kill the Newsletter. So when I'm actually deploying the application here, I use a GitHub action to deploy the application. That's the SSH key that is used. Now for the host name, you can do whatever you want here. You can even follow this weird suggestion from DigitalOcean, but I advise you to use the domain that you bought. So if you're going to run this application, for instance, in example.com, I advise you to use the host name example.com. This doesn't really matter in most cases. It will only matter if you are trying to send email, which is not the case here. We only receive email. But if you're trying to send email, then you need to have this thing called a PTR DNS record. And if you use the host name of your domain here in this part of the creation of the machine, then DigitalOcean will do the PTR record for you for free. More or less, you still need to set up the name servers for this work, but for the most part, you will be good to go. And even though we are not sending email, I follow this practice of using the name that I'm going to use in the application that I'm deploying. So now we need to talk about that. Well, I didn't want to buy a domain just for this video. So what I did is I have this domain, liafac.com. It's my website. You can go to liafac.com. And I have this subdomain, killthenewsletter.liafac.com. So it's a subdomain, and that's something you can do as well. So maybe you already have a domain, a landing page or portfolio or your CV, and then you can just use a subdomain to host Kill the Newsletter. That's just fine. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We are going to host this on killthenewsletter.liafac.com. If you don't have a domain, then you need to go to a place like Namecheap. And I wish these companies were sponsoring this channel. They are not. I am just literally paying for these services and I like them. So that's what I'm showing you. And if you are interested in supporting this channel so that maybe someday we will get sponsors, then you can go to my Patreon, you can go to PayPal. Okay, enough of that. So that's the host name for the application that we're going to deploy. And you can go to something like Namecheap and buy your own domain. It's all, you don't have, that part is not technical. You just fill in some forms and you put in your credit card and you'll have a domain. I don't use tags. That would be to organize if you have many machines in DigitalOcean and you want to keep track of them, then you would use tags. I don't use them. And then I enable backups every time because they cost $1 extra, but it's peace of mind. I have never used the backups. Let's keep it that way. Anyway, enable backups. Create a droplet. The droplet is a machine. That's how DigitalOcean calls a machine. And we are just going to have SSH access into this machine. We'll be able to log into the machine and run commands on the command line like we would run commands on the command line on our machine. So this is the time DigitalOcean takes to actually spin up a new server, set up the network so that it's accessible from the internet, and it's kind of pretty fast. It's okay. Okay, and a few seconds more have passed, and we have here our new droplet. And it has even an IP address that is accessible from the internet. There is one extra step here that is optional, but I really advise you to do this, which is to assign this thing called a floating IP to the machine. And a floating IP is just yet another IP address that points to your machine. Let's look at how we can set this up, and I will show you what it is, and then we can talk about why that is a good strategy. So let's try to find where this would go. I think that this is under these settings, and these things change. The dashboard for DigitalOcean is always changing. This is the sort of graph that we will be able to look at because we enabled metrics. For now, of course, because the machine is too new, there is no graphics to look at, but it will monitor the bandwidth, the CPU, the disk, all the things that matter. Okay, so networking. Oh, here it is, floating IP, enable now. It will be just another, assign a floating IP to this machine. And what this is just an extra IP that is pointing at this machine. Now, the cool thing about a floating IP is that within DigitalOcean, I am able to switch this IP address to a different droplet, a different machine very easily. I can take this floating IP that's currently pointing at the new machine that we just created, and we can reassign it. For instance, we can unassign, and we could assign it to other droplets. I suppose that I cannot assign it to killthenewsletter.com because that one already has a floating IP pointing at it. Probably it's not possible to point multiple floating IPs to the same droplet. The point here is we can switch to another machine, and that is instantaneous. That is a change that happens within DigitalOcean, the routing mechanism in DigitalOcean, and that is immediate. As soon as you click the button, it will be reassigned. And that is in opposition to DNS. So now let's talk about DNS. DNS is also a way to map, now it's not an IP address, but a name. So it will be a name like killthenewsletter.liafac.com. So we are mapping names to IP addresses. So we are saying that when you go to killthenewsletter.liafac.com, really your browser should request the website that sits on a certain IP address that represents certain machine in the world. So it's like a phone book where you look up the name and you find the person's telephone. Now, the problem with DNS, which is also an advantage, but the problem with DNS for our purposes here is that it takes a while for changes to take effect. And that's because DNS needs to be super fast. Imagine, people are requesting websites all over the world, millions of times per second. So this system needs to be robust, it needs to be fast. And the way that we achieve that speed is by a lot of caching. So there are DNS servers all over the world that cache the responses from DNS queries, which means that when we make a change to DNS, it takes a while for this change to go to all these other servers around the world. And that thing is called DNS propagation. It takes a while. So we make a change here. It may take a few minutes. It may take hours. I guess up to 48 hours for some of the cache to expire and your DNS to fully propagate. So if we were to create a new droplet here in DigitalOcean, suppose that something happened with our deployment, or we just want to update to a new version of Ubuntu or whatever, we can create a new droplet and we can reassign the floating IP to the new machine, and that's instantaneous. If we were to do the same thing and reassign the name to another IP address, that would take up to 2 days to take effect. That's why I think that having floating IPs is advantageous. And when we do the DNS configuration, we will not point to the IP address of the droplet we created. We will point to the floating IP that is associated with that droplet. So we can go here to our machine and we can see that it has an IP, but we're not going to use it. We're going to use the floating IP instead. Okay, so notice how we start to have some graphs here. We already have some activity. That's nice. It only took a few minutes for these things to update. Okay, so we have the floating IP address. Let's copy this and go to Namecheap. That is the DNS server I am using. If you buy your domain elsewhere, you are going to see a panel that looks different, but the terminology is about the same. And if you even bought a domain elsewhere, you can use free DNS from Namecheap. And as far as I can tell, DigitalOcean also has a DNS service. So if you buy a domain from somewhere that does not have DNS for you, you can just use DNS from DigitalOcean. That will work fine. So you can see that I already have here a test record. I'm going to delete that. And this screen is pretty much what you're going to see when you create a new domain from scratch, or you buy a new domain from scratch. And there are several kinds of DNS records that we need to know. I guess it's like 4 of them. So DNS, it's like an address book, look up names, find IP addresses, and it has different kinds of records. So not all entries in the phone book look exactly the same. The first kind of entry is super important, but you probably don't have to set up on your own because you're probably going to use the DNS server that comes with your provider of your domain, wherever you buy the domain from. But it's usually set up for you in that case. But if you need to use DigitalOcean's DNS server, or if you want to use the free DNS from Namecheap, but you bought your domain elsewhere, you need to know about this kind of DNS record. So we'll go here and create a new record so I can show you. It's an NS for name server. This is, it answers a simple question. If I am looking for qthenewsletter.liafac.com, where is this entry? Where is the authoritative source of truth for this domain? Who is in charge of this domain? Who should I ask to when I need to know something about the DNS for this domain? As I said, this thing is cached all over the world, but it must come from somewhere, right? Where is the source of truth for this? Well, it's in the name server record. And usually the name server will be set up for you, and usually there will be tutorials about how to set up the name servers for different providers. But it's important that you understand what's going on there. In this case, I don't even see the name servers here for this domain. They are not even listed, but they exist. They are somewhere in the Namecheap configuration here, somewhere hidden in some network configuration that I'm not able to access from this dashboard. There exists a name server record for this. I will prove it to you. There is this tool called What's My DNS. There are plenty of tools like this. What this does is it makes a DNS request to servers all over the world. You can see here them on a map. And anytime you access this, it will pick a different set of name servers for you. So I can do a lookup for qthenewsletter.liafac.com, and I'm specifically looking for name server entries. And you can see that, yes, in some places this has not propagated. I created this like 1 hour ago. But But in most places, it knows that these are the name server entries records for this subdomain. And that's how I configure things so that I can use Namecheap as my name server, as my DNS server. I could do something like use DigitalOcean instead, and I would have to set things up differently, but then these name servers would be pointing at DigitalOcean. Registrar servers are Namecheap's servers. Okay, so let me refresh this page, and we don't have to set up NS records, but we have to understand what they are. Next, we have to understand what A records are. Those are just literally mapping names to domains, to IP addresses. So that is pretty easy. What IP address we want? Well, we want this floating IP, so I will copy again and paste it here. And let's try and see if this works, if I can leave this host empty, because I would like to say that killthenewsletter.liafact.com maps to this IP address, and let's see if that works. Okay, so this is complaining. A value must be provided. Okay, so there is no indication here in this dashboard, but there is a magic value for host. @ If you say that the host is the @ sign, it means the top level thing. So it means, in my case, killthenewsletter.liafact.com. So now I can save this, and the @ means this. But usually you would like www. To map to the same place. That's where the next kind of entry comes into play. And I said there would be 4, I think there will actually be 5 kinds of records that we want to talk about. But the CNAME record is something that maps a name to another name. It's like a forward. So if you are looking for www.killthenewsletter.liafact.com, really what you should be looking at is killthenewsletter.com, .liafact.com. So it's just a forwarding. Okay, so if you ever want to resolve, if you ever want to look up www.killthenewsletter.liafact.com, forget about it. What you should look up instead is killthenewsletter.liafact.com. CNAME stands for common name, I think. It's a kind of forwarding in the DNS level. Now, a CNAME is great, and in many cases, that's all you have. For instance, in the DNS server from DigitalOcean, you have to use CNAMEs. But there is a problem with CNAMEs, and the problem is it does not work at the top level. So if you wanted to have your domain, like example.com, you wanted that to be a forward to something else, you cannot do that. CNAMEs don't work on the top level. Well, they do, but they break all the infrastructure because a CNAME is really a forwarding thing. And even if you are doing a lookup, for instance, for the NS kind of record, so even if you are looking up for who is the authoritative source of truth for this domain, if you have a CNAME at this point, the NS record should be looked at this other place as well. It should forward the lookup for the NS record itself. So it throws things into a loop, right? You are trying to solve the domain, and then you do a forwarding because you're doing a CNAME, even off the source of truth for the own domain. It's a dog chasing its own tail. So I guess it works in some contexts. It may make sense to use a CNAME at the top level, but in most cases, you want to avoid that. So let's not use CNAME. We could, right? Because we are trying to forward the lookup for www. Our domain. But we can, so in this case, we could use a CNAME. But just for good measure, I got used to using this other kind of record. This one is not in the specification for DNS. It's not something you're going to find in every DNS server out there. It's not something you're going to find on the DNS server for DigitalOcean, as far as I can tell. But it's provided by many DNS servers, including Namecheap. It's not standard. It's an alias record. it behaves pretty much like a CNAME in all practical purposes, but it works differently under the hood. What happens when you use this alias record is Namecheap itself, or your DNS server itself, is going to look up the rest of the chain. So it's going to look up, so in this case I'm forwarding www to this address. So it will do the lookup for qthenewsletter.liafact.com, and it will respond with an IP address. So it has done the full resolution and answered for you. The effects that this has is that from whoever is asking, what is the name, what does this name resolve to, it resolves to a certain IP address. It looks like an A record for that matter. But Namecheap is smart enough to change the IP address. If you change this record, Namecheap will do a new lookup and it will find the right answer. And it will not forward. And this works at the top level. Alias records work at the top level. In fact, I think that was the motivation for creating them, to overcome this shortcoming of CNAMEs. So they work at the top level, and as I said, what's going to happen here is not to really forward the lookup. So it will not forward NS lookups. It won't do that, because Namecheap will look, what does this resolve to? And it will answer with the same answer. So it will just forward the answer for you. But it will do that in a smart way. So if you try to look up for NS records, it will not forward that. It will not do the wrong thing. It will not overwrite your expectations in that way. So both CNAMEs and alias would work in this case. I'm going with alias just because it's more general, though it's not a standard. So that's all I need for this. I am going to save all my changes. And now we need to talk about the next kind of record. I said there would be 5. So we talked about namespaces, we talked about A records, we talked about CNAMEs, aliases. Now let's talk about MX records. MX stands for mail exchange, and it is okay, so I'm sending some email to qthenewsletter.liafact.com. Where should this email go to? It should go to a certain machine, right? And here we are going to say what that machine is. So there are different email settings. Namecheap has this email forwarding service. So if I were to enable this, then I could receive email for qthenewsletter.liafact.com on my iCloud account or on my Gmail account or whatever. But I'm not using email forwarding, I'm using custom MX because I want emails to go to my Kill the Newsletter application. I'm going to pause right now and check what is the DNS situation over here for these entries I just created. They may have propagated already in these few seconds I have been talking, or they may still be propagating. More realistically, they're probably going to be propagating in some servers and not in others. So now let's look at qthenewsletter.liafact.com, but let's look at the A record, and we should see this number, which is our floating IP at DigitalOcean. So let's search for that. And it has resolved to that number in many places. That was fast. And then the www version of that, as I said, this is not a CNAME, so if we do a lookup for CNAME, we shouldn't see anything. But if we do a lookup for A, and you can see here that there is no alias kind, right? Because alias is not a standard. It's kind of a hack to work around this limitation of CNAMEs. But if we look at the A record, it also resolves to that name, to that IP address. So it resolves to this floating IP as well. So as I said, this is kind of a hack, but now it looks like there is an A record, and if I were to change the whatever this is pointing at, then this would change as well, because Namecheap will do the lookup under the hood. So it pretends that it's an A record, but in reality it's this kind of alias record. So okay, awesome, that has propagated. When you create a new entry, it usually propagates really fast. Though not always, sometimes you have to wait 2 days. Or I also found, and that's something it's worth mentioning, I also found that sometimes when it's taking too long, it's worth deleting and recreating it. For some reason, sometimes that speeds things up. Okay, MX records. So if we were to send an email to as we learned, means killthenewsletter.liafac.com. If we were to send some email to that address, so it would be something like example at killthenewsletter.liafac.com. If we were to send an email to this address, then it should go to some mail server. What is that mail server? Well, in our case, it's just this name. So we are going to grab it from here. Oh, and you can see that this is like a weird thing about DNS. Domains in DNS usually end with a dot. You don't have to worry about that because Namecheap is going to fill that in for you. But depending on your DNS server, you may have to include this dot, just so you know. But I'm not doing that here. So I'm saying that emails sent to this address should go to this machine. Effectively, that will do a lookup for this A record at the end of the day. And then I have a priority. You may have multiple email servers and you can give them different priorities. They are usually numbers like 10 or 20. And the server that has the highest priority, which is the lowest number, will be attempted first. And if your first email is down, email server is down, then you can try the next one up the list. Now let's save these changes, and I am going to look up the MX record real quick. Let's see if this propagates instantaneously. It won't. It will take at least a few minutes, but we can do a lookup for MX records, and yeah, it has not propagated yet. Don't worry, it will propagate in a few minutes. While it's propagating, we can move on to the next step, which is to go to the machine that we have created and we have already assigned a name to. We need to go to this machine to start setting up Kill the Newsletter. So let's go back to the terminal and open a new tab. Oh, we were still running our local version of Kill the Newsletter. We don't need that. So now I want to SSH into the machine, and I have already set up the SSH keys when creating the machine. So I can just go to root at killthenewsletter.liafac.com. And because the DNS has already resolved, this will work. And it's the first time we are accessing that machine, so it asks if we are sure that this is the correct machine, and I suppose it is. Now we are on that machine. And we have to, again, I think it's a good thing to create a directory for the application. So I'll create this directory and I will go into that directory and I will download the binary for Kill the Newsletter, coming back here to the release. And this time I will grab the binary for Linux because I am running Ubuntu. So I will wget that. And that was fast. Now I will tar extract zip file kill the newsletter tgz. It's a tarball, and now I have the executable right here. And I will remove the tarball. This time, though, we are running in production. We are running for real. We don't want to run the development/demonstration version of Kill the Newsletter. For that, we'll have to create a proper configuration file for Kill the Newsletter. So this part, I guess probably this is one of the first few parts that is specific to how we are deploying Kill the Newsletter proper. The application Kill the Newsletter is configured in this way. If you were to deploy a different application, it would be configured differently. The way you configure Kill the Newsletter is with a JavaScript file that Kill the Newsletter is going to load or require when it's starting up. So we will start with this example. It is the configuration that is actually running at killthenewsletter.com. And we are going to grab this and download to our server. So now we have this file and we need to adapt its contents to our deployment. So here where we see this URL, That's the URL where you are going to find the service, and in our case, it's killthenewsletter.liafact.com. Now for the email, that is the email address at which you are going to receive emails. So it's going to be killthenewsletter.liafact.com. That was a weird way of writing this. Anyway, so this address over here must match our MX record on our DNS. Let's check if this has propagated. Oh, it has propagated in one place. In two places. It will get there. It will get there. So now, for the next part, the administrator. It should be like your email, really, because that's the email address that I show in the application in case some error occurs. I say, oh, you should send an email to the administrator, and I put your email there. But in my case, it will be, demonstration@liafact.com. That's my real email address. Next up, we don't have to touch any of these, but we do have to touch these, okay? So we have two domains here that we want to serve our application from. One is killthenewsletter.liafact.com, and the other one is www.killthenewsletter.liafact.com. So now we can save and close this, and we are ready to start the application. We can say that we want to start Kill the Newsletter and that we want to use the configuration file over here. So now that we run this, it will load that configuration file, and it will behave differently from what happened when we ran this locally. Because this time it's running in production. So now it's setting up TLS keys. It's setting up for HTTPS, which is something that you definitely want because you want the padlock here. And it has started the email server as well. And it's saying that the certificate doesn't exist because we just created this machine. It will be provisioned on the first hit to the server. So now we are ready to go to our new deployment and see what happens. So the email server has already started because the email server doesn't really need TLS keys. It doesn't provide the TLS service at all. So the email server is already in place. We could, in theory, send email to this server if only our DNS was in place. And it's in place in more places now. It's taking longer, but it's getting there. But I don't think the email server would be reachable from most places. But anyway, we can go to killthenewsletter.liafact.com, and you can see the browser is hanging here. It doesn't do anything for a while. And that's because here on the server, it's working. It's getting the new TLS keys, it's setting everything up, and it's already good to go. Look at that. So I can see here, it didn't work the first time. So if I refresh, now I have a padlock, and I am able to look at killthenewsletter.liafact.com, our newly deployed Kill the Newsletter instance. And this is running live. Anyone in the world can go to this address and they will see this as well. Now let's create a newsletter. A new newsletter from the new server. And that should work just fine. We can now send an email to this address. And this time we don't have to go to the command line and use curl. We can literally go to our email client and literally send an email to this address, and it should appear over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the command line and open a new tab. So we can see that there is the welcome entry here, but there are no other entries. And I'm going to go to my email client, send an email, and see it appear here. Okay, so let's do this. I am going to copy this email address, and this is the to, and hello. And then some good emoji, not this one, that one. Awesome, and let's put some emoji here as well, big poop, and goodbye. So now I'm literally sending an email using my iCloud email service, and I should be able to go to this URL and see hello. and this is the textual representation of that emoji, and so on. So we literally got an email using the newly deployed Kill the Newsletter instance. Isn't that great? I think this is a lot of fun, how easy relatively this is once you understand what DNS is and how to create a server on DigitalOcean. It's not that hard. You just get a new machine and you start running. Now, there are a few things that I should mention. What happens first with this sudo stuff? I mean, I'm running this as root. Usually that's frowned upon. People don't like running services as sudo. Some services don't even run as sudo. Kill the Newsletter happens to not look at that, and it doesn't really complain if you're trying to run this as root. But there are services that would not allow you to run as root. And I think that the most important thing in this machine, in my case, in this deployment, the only important thing in this machine is the data, the actual newsletters. Where are they? Well, I can log into the machine using a different tab. So SSH root at killthenewsletter.lia5.com, and for every application the data will live in a different place. But for Kill the Newsletter, it lives right next to your executable and your configuration in this data folder. You can check that the data folder has a database file with all your data, with all your feeds or the entries in the feeds, and it also has here some keys. My TLS keys are living here. That's really the only thing that matters on this machine. I don't care about anything else. And that needs to be accessible by my application. It needs to be accessible by Kill the Newsletter, right? Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to read or write to the database. So the only thing that I care about on the machine needs to be accessible by the Kill the Newsletter executable. So if I were to create a user that is not root just to run my application, that's some extra work. And what security would I be getting? In this case, none, because I am literally handing the most important data on my machine to that service, to that application. So in my case, I don't think it matters to have a separate user with fewer privileges just to run my application. In particular, it would need to be able to bind to ports like 80 and 443, which are the ports for HTTP and HTTPS respectively. All those problems of being able to bind to a certain network port, or I think that's the only case, the only thing in this case. Oh, also port 25 for the email server. All those things, I would need to configure a new user and configure the service to run with that user and then configure the ports to be allowed by that user. I don't have to do any of that using root. And as I said, I don't think I am getting any extra privileges or any extra security measures by having a separate user, because I'm handing the most important thing, the data, the application data, to the service. That's my approach for system administration, keeping it simple. Okay, one more thing that I want to mention. What if you are not deploying Kill the Newsletter, an application that is so easy to deploy that it sets up its own TLS keys? Or alternatively, what happens if you want to have multiple services running on your machine and you don't want them to necessarily all bind to ports 80 and 443, right? Only one thing can bind to a certain point at a time, to a certain port at a time. In that case, I suggest using this other web server in front of your application. This is a strategy called a reverse proxy. And I recommend this Caddy server thing. Super easy to set up. It's similar to Kill the Newsletter in the sense that it's going to set up TLS keys for you. You just say what domains you want to use and it's going to do its thing. If your application is not Kill the Newsletter, it's not so easy to deploy, then take a look at Caddy. It will be almost as easy as Kill the Newsletter. And I'm bragging here because it was a lot of work to set up Kill the Newsletter in this way. As I said, I had to come up with my own packager for Node.js applications, and I had to find this dependency I'm using to handle TLS, which is the small web stuff, auto encrypt, I think it's the name. Anyway, it was a lot of work to set all this up, so I kind of brag about this. So yeah, that's the point about Caddy. Now let's move on to the final thing I want to talk about, and that is what happens when the server crashes, because it will. It's an application. Applications crash. It happens. In fact, I can cause a crash to happen here. I have two instances of terminals that are looking at the same server. So this is us running the application, and this is us connected to the same server. And I can PS, and I can grab for kill the newsletter, and that it will give us the name and the number, the process number for this server over here. So I'm going to cause a crash by killing the application, and see the application crashed. And if I go to the application again, oh, it shouldn't work. This is still working. What's happening? Let's kill more stuff. There is also this process, so let's kill that one as well. Okay, now we killed the server. That was a resilient server. So we want the application to restart in case it goes down. Also, anytime we reboot the machine, which is something we can do from the command line, or here from DigitalOcean from the panel, we can reboot the machine. You should do it from the command line, because doing this is almost similar to like unplugging the machine from the wall. Not usually how you turn off your computer, but anyway, you can reboot, and when you do, you want the server to just you want kill the newsletter to just restart along with the server. So that's what we are going to do next. Something that restarts the server when it goes down because it crashed, and that starts the server as soon as the machine boots. For doing that, there are thousands of ways of doing this, but the simplest is to use the process manager from the operating system itself. Ubuntu, the operating system we are using for the server, has this thing called systemd, and it is a service runner. When you start a machine, the first thing that starts is systemd, and it's responsible for managing all other processes. We can tell systemd that we want kill the newsletter to run as soon as the machine starts, and we can tell systemd to restart kill the newsletter when it goes down. To do that, I am going to configure using this, again from the deployment example, it is literally the configuration that is running on killthenewsletter.com, not the version we just deployed, the version that is running live. It has this configuration for systemd. So again, I'll go to raw, and I will copy this address, and I will come here to the server, and I will wget. And now I have this configuration, but I need to move this configuration to a particular directory where systemd looks for the configurations. And this is in etc systemd. And here there are folders. I think that the best way to do this is to put it on the system folder, and I will just move it there. And now I'll look at the contents of this file. Okay, so what is this saying? First, the name of the service, and then when it runs. It runs as soon as the network is ready. So your machine starts, and it starts a bunch of things like the network. So as soon as the network card has loaded and it's accessible from the internet, then I want to run my application. What is my application? Well, it is this command. It's literally the command that we ran from the command line before, except that I'm giving absolute paths for it to find the executable and the configuration. So you can say, for instance, here in this, I am on the right folder. You can see that this is the path to this folder, to the configuration. So the absolute path of the configuration is this. And then I need to pass this environment variable so that Node is running in production mode. I am running as root for reasons stated before, and I want the application to restart anytime it crashes. Also, I think that this part is kind of optional. I don't remember, but what this is saying is, it's a weird way of saying this, but I want this to run at every boot. So anytime the machine boots, I want to run this. When in the boot? After the network, but I want it all to run this at boot, and that's what this part is saying. So that's what this configuration is saying. Now I need to copy some incantations from the deployment scripts in Kill the Newsletter. So, or actually from the README. I think I have that on the README as well. Yeah, it was right there on the screen and I moved. System control. Yeah. So there are these 3 commands that I need to run now. This is going to load this new file that we created. This is going to enable this service so that it starts at every boot. So that multi-user target once, whatever, from the configuration is now here as well. So we have this running on every boot. And I want to start the application. I can say restart, right? It doesn't really matter. But this is going to start the application using systemd. I don't see anything, but supposedly it has started. So let's PS, and yes, there is something happening. We can use system control to talk to systemd and check the status of Kill the Newsletter. And it says that it's active, it's running. And I see some logs, it's good. I can also use journal control to look at the logs for the application. Specifically, I want to use a -u. That means the target, the service that I want to look at. So Kill the Newsletter. And I can see all the logs since the application started, which is not a lot of logs, but it's something. It says that it's running, it's picking up the certificate from before, and it says that the certificate already exists because we created it when we ran the application from the command line before. So it only refreshes this once every month, I think. Yeah, it will refresh that every month. So yeah, the application is running, and now we can go to killthenewsletter.liafact.com, and the application is there, and we can create a newsletter with systemd, and it created a new newsletter. And more importantly, let's look at the PID. So the process ID is this one. That is the version of Kill the Newsletter run by systemd. So I can kill that. And just for good measure, I will kill this as well because I don't know. And now we can see that, yeah, it just started new versions. You can see that these numbers are different because it started a new version. So we just simulated a crash and systemd restarted the applications. We can go to killthenewsletter.liafact.com and it's still there. It's still working. The same would happen if we reboot the machine. And let's do that right now. So we can just say halt, or actually I guess I can say reboot. I think that reboots the machine, and because we just rebooted, we were disconnected from the machine. If we go to killthenewsletter.liafact.com, it will probably not resolve right now because the machine is rebooting. And it takes a while, like it needs to stop all the services and restart everything, but it takes a while, but it will do it. And when it does, I guess it already did because we were able to connect to the machine. I did not restart anything on the command line. Systemd restarted the thing as soon as the machine booted. Excellent. Okay, that is more or less everything I wanted to say about this. There are still more things to cover, of course. There are advanced configurations for things like, what if you already have an email server running on your machine? What you already have a web server running on your machine with other websites? And what happens if you just want to change the configuration to customize Kill the Newsletter in any way? Well, the good news is that Kill the Newsletter is a Node.js application, and the way it starts is by looking at the configuration file that is literally just JavaScript. So you can do whatever you want with Kill the Newsletter. In fact, you can install Kill the Newsletter as an NPM package. If you are a Node.js developer, you can just use Kill the Newsletter as a smaller part of a bigger Express application. So you can just embed Kill the Newsletter into your application. And you can customize in any way how that application is going to load Kill the Newsletter and work with Kill the Newsletter. But for this video, I wanted to keep things short and sweet. Short to a certain extent. I mean, this is probably going to be over an hour, but we covered a lot of ground. And that's pretty much all there is to deploying a web application, even one that has an email component, so it's not exactly trivial, and how to deploy with TLS and everything. And in most cases, the application is not going to handle TLS itself, so you would have to use Caddy, but that's more or less all there is to this story. It is to configure DNS, to create a new server, point the DNS to the server, log into the server, start the services, configure systemd so that the services restart, and you're live, and that's it. I hope you liked watching this walkthrough, and make sure you subscribe to this channel because there are always more videos like this coming up. In fact, I'm planning on having a walkthrough to the code for Kill the Newsletter. I have done that in the past. I have done a code review in the past, but many things changed in the application recently. And I'm going to probably do another code review. I always have other videos about programming. I do live coding sessions. I do code reviews. I talk about how to create audio plugins. I should get back to that really soon. Anyway, subscribe to the channel. Make sure you support me on Patreon, on PayPal. Go to GitHub, start the repository, all that fun stuff. Thanks for watching. I see you on the next one. Bye.